Washington, D.C.
They treat us very badly. Canada treats us very badly. And people oftentimes, they'll ask me, who's the worst to deal with on trade? And I said, that's easy, Canada. They are the worst to trade. And they feel entitled, and just we can't have that.
Tonight, Lake America. President Trump signing an order renaming Lake Ontario for the U.S. government, escalating his trade feud with Canada after negotiations collapsed. High-level talks have yet to resume, and a prolonged dispute could raise costs for consumers with just 2 months before the midterm elections. Plus, where's the beef? Trump temporarily lifts tariffs on some additional beef imports in a bid to lower prices for consumers, but the move is drawing backlash from ranchers and rural state Republicans, creating a new political risk for the GOP ahead of November. We'll discuss the industry with Texas Ag Commissioner Sid Miller. And Texas Hold'em. President Trump heading to Houston today for an RNC fundraiser where he's expected to rally support for Republican Senate nominee Ken Paxton. The visit comes as Democrats grow more hopeful about James Talarico's chances in Texas, putting a longtime Republican stronghold more firmly on the midterm map. From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Tyler Kendall. Kaylee has the night off.
And Joe, we begin tonight at the White House, where President Trump just left for Houston, Texas. That's where he's set to headline a critical fundraiser for what's typically a safely Republican-held Senate seat, but has quickly become competitive.
We're working very hard. We want to win that race. We have a very good candidate, Ken Paxton, and he's running against Telefrico, they call him, because he is a little freaky, and that's not a man that represents the value of Texas. So I'm going to help Ken Paxton, and I'm going to spend a lot of time in Texas.
The latest polling out of Texas showing Democratic candidate James Talarico polling ahead of the Republican candidate there, Ken Paxton, with the president's visit serving as a fresh test of his potential political sway. Let's get now to Bloomberg's Kate Sullivan, who joins us live at the White House for more. So, Kate, just how much of a boost could President Trump give Ken Paxton at this point in the race? And how is this underscoring where GOP resources are going, considering that this is normally a reliably red seat?
That's right. Democrats are pretty hopeful right now. It's important to remember a Democrat has not won statewide office in Texas in more than 30 years. But the polling is showing that this race is quite close. They're feeling like they have a good chance. So we'll see. The president is on his way right now to Houston, Texas. He's going to headline a Republican National Committee event tonight, a fundraiser. He's really looking to inject some cash in particular into Ken Paxton's campaign. Ken Paxton is, of course, running against Democrat James Talarico. There's a large disparity right now when it comes to the cash on hand that they have. The June filing showed that Ken Paxton had roughly $2 million cash on hand compared to Talarico's roughly $21 million. So we'll see. Trump is definitely looking to give Ken Paxton a boost and other Republican candidates in the state ahead of these critical November midterm elections.
Kate, it seemed the president didn't have Texas on his mind today, but Canada, different border, with a couple of storylines here. He's taken actual pen to paper or Sharpie today to rename Lake Ontario Lake America. I guess at least in terms of the U.S. government using that language, but also reporting that came from the USTR in an interview with Fox News that we're thinking about banning some Canadian goods. This obsession is not over, huh?
Definitely not over, and it doesn't look like these tensions with Canada and this trade war is going to ease anytime soon. I think those comments that Greer made this morning were especially helpful to understand where we are right now. He said that talks remain suspended. He said that there is not an open channel right now with his counterpart. He also said that the U.S. is considering outright banning some Canadian goods, and he even acknowledged, he said, we've never done these bans. It is quite extreme, but maybe we need to. So right now, we're just hearing a lot of threats from the president and the USTR right now in terms of where the U.S. and Canada, where things are headed. It does not look like tensions are easing anytime soon.
Well, these are all questions that the White House press secretary gets queries about every day from reporters over where you are. Today's Karoline Leavitt's last day. Kate, what do we know about replacement plans for her or anything that the president has planned as she departs from the post?
That's right. So Karoline Leavitt has been serving as press secretary since Trump took office, and today was her last day. We do not at this point know who is going to take over for her. That decision has not been made. And when Karoline Leavitt was on maternity leave, we saw sort of a rotating cast of characters in the briefing room. We heard from the vice president, the secretary of state, the treasury secretary. They all took to the podium in the briefing room to brief reporters when it was specifically something that made sense for them to do. So I would expect that the administration is going to implement a similar kind of rotation until someone is named. In terms of who it could be, the list, we don't know exactly who is going to be her replacement. We've heard from several people that the list could be long. Ultimately, of course, the president will make this decision. I would not be surprised if it's somebody who appears on television a lot. Just going back to when the president made his cabinet picks, that was something that several of the people that he chose had in common. But really, it could be anyone.
We'll find out on the next episode of The Apprentice. Kate, thank you so much. Bloomberg's Kate Sullivan on the North Lawn this evening. As the president makes his way to Texas, we bring in Jessica Taylor, Senate and Governor's editor at the always important Cook Political Report. It's great to have you with us, knowing that just about a week ago, you put this Senate race in Texas into the toss-up category. What changed?
We're seeing public and private polling that shows this race is tied, basically. And as Kate was talking about there, James Tallarico has a significant money advantage over Ken Paxton. But Ken Paxton, for Trump saying he's a strong candidate, he's actually very weak, especially with Republican voters and independent voters. I mean, this would not be a race if it were John Cornyn, the incumbent, who Paxton defeated in that Republican runoff back in May, if Cornyn were the nominee. This is honestly a headache of President Trump's own making because he didn't back Cornyn. Paxton has so much baggage, both personal, professional, that he is just a very polarizing figure to voters, and it has put Texas in play for the first time in decades.
So if this is more about the candidate, then how much sway could President Trump have, considering that we're seeing him deploy here not just to rally voters, but also to rally the cash behind him?
Well, he can certainly help with the cash, and that's one of the big things that Paxton needs right now, just to catch up so that he, Tallarico has been outspending Republicans on air. Really, there's been kind of a game of finger pointing going on between national Republicans, that they know that they need to pony up for this race, but they don't want to take money away from other very competitive races. So is MAGA Inc. going to spend? Is Elon Musk going to spend here? But Paxton, that money can go further than some of the super PAC money can. So Trump helping him certainly will help bolster him in Texas. But I think, they need to start attacking Paxton, too, to try to bring him down. And there are some very controversial things that Tallarico has said about transgender, about non-binary, that they will work to paint him as too outside of the mainstream in Texas. And that might work. But ultimately, if they make this a referendum on Ken Paxton, this could be a really hard race for Republicans to hold on to.
Well, MAGA Inc. certainly made a dent in South Carolina with a more than $800,000 spend. I guess we'll see what comes here to a race that might not have cost a penny in another world, to your point, if he had gone with John Cornyn. But it's really interesting, the messaging, as you're getting to this on both sides, has really crystallized to very simple things. James Tallarico doesn't have the manhood or the T to be a senator in Texas. And he says that Ken Paxton is a criminal. Is that what this comes down to?
I think that you work to demonize the other side, but we see Democrats are more energized in Texas. They narrowly outperformed Republicans in the primary, which has not happened in quite a while. So I think that you're seeing Tallarico on the ground reach out to Republicans, reach out to independents, and that could be the path to forward. I mean, of course, the last closest Senate race we had was in 2018 with Beto O'Rourke. Beto O'Rourke was not doing this well in polling this close to the election. So, this could be a much closer race. I think that certainly Ted Cruz had his weaknesses as a candidate, but he did not have this much baggage that could fit a cowboy hat, a very deep cowboy hat in Texas.
Well, to your point, Texas wasn't necessarily on our bingo card as competitive races to watch, but there are other ones, including in Michigan and Ohio. Bloomberg News came out with an analysis today saying that the trade dispute with Canada is going to hit those places the hardest. But I'm wondering how you're seeing Republicans navigate this, because on one hand, there could be blowback when it comes to the tariffs, but these are also places where the president's more protectionist policies could also resonate. We have reporting that the domestic steel industry, for example, was thrilled that these trade talks fell apart.
Yeah, I think the steel industry is important, certainly in places like Ohio. I'm also looking to other states that have close proximity to Canada, share a border, like Maine and New Hampshire. It could also impact there. Michigan, of course, so close to Canada. I'm wondering, too, I've heard about just lower tourism from Canada that places will rely on. So it has an effect, I think, across the economy. It's not just goods, but it's services and people coming in and out of the U.S. as well.
Yeah, we've heard repeatedly it's hard to find a Canadian in Las Vegas this summer, Jessica. So just broadly speaking, stick with the map here. Let's say Democrats turn Texas remarkable, unthought of even a couple of years ago. What does that do to that opens up multiple paths to taking. Now we don't have to worry as much about Maine, for instance. What else might the party be able to do in terms of redeploying resources?
Well, I mean, Michigan is still a big headache for Democrats that they have to defend there.
Still a must win.
I think that if Texas and Iowa are on the table, which is the other race that we moved into the toss-up column, perhaps if they lose Michigan, they have another path. I'm watching to see if this becomes more about Trump or is it more about the candidates themselves. If it's more about candidate quality, then that's a problem in Texas, but it's also a problem for Democrats in Michigan with Abdul al-Sayed.
Yeah.
We could talk about this all day. We so thank you for your insights. Jessica Taylor of the Cook Political Report, thanks for joining us here on Bloomberg. And we want to turn now to Wall Street, where it was a big day for tech after the world's biggest company reported record earnings and a stronger than expected forecast. Last night, NVIDIA led the way higher, helping to revive the AI trade. It's time for Power Moves with Bloomberg's Nora Melinda, who joins us now from World Headquarters in New York. Hey, Nora.
Hey, Tyler. Big tech certainly driving this market today. Well, more specifically, NVIDIA. Revenue expected to grow by about 70% next fiscal year. That's shattering estimates of growth of about 45% and certainly driving the rally that we saw in the market, led by those tech stocks that I mentioned. If you take a look under the hood at IMAP, we see about 10 sectors in the red, but the one remaining in the green, that's tech, up by 3%, and really actively lifting the market as a whole. The NASDAQ 100 higher by about 1.4%. The S&P 500 higher by 0.7%, but the Dow Jones Industrial Average just up marginally. But the best performer in the S&P 500 today, important to call out, Salesforce, seeing its best day in 6 years. Now, this comes after a strong revenue guide, but also an expanded partnership with Anthropic that got investors quite excited. This all really reassuring investors that it can compete in this AI era.
Yeah, so much for the SaaSpocalypse today, Nora. I'm looking at the bond market today. It was pretty subdued. Yields up a few ticks depending on where you're looking. We've got Jackson Hole on the brain for tomorrow. How's the bond market positioning ahead of the Fed chair speech?
Well, you called it out. The bond market is a little bit cautious heading into this commentary that we're going to get from Kevin Warsh tomorrow. We know that long-term rates remain elevated, and Warsh has really been underscoring this idea that he wants the market to talk instead of the Fed. So you'll see investors really trying to parse through the tea leaves and get some sort of indication as to what he's thinking, whether or not there's a hike down the road. We got some commentary from two Fed officials today that seem to lean a little bit more on the hawkish side. So the question will essentially be whether or not Warsh is actually in line with some of these counterparts, or if he actually has a different view as to where we're headed forward, with the bond market really just looking for some reassurance that the Fed can essentially have a credible plan to bring inflation back down to that target being 2%.
Great, Nora. Another big day ahead. Bloomberg's Nora Melinda live in New York. Thank you, as always. Coming up, a chilling turn of events, potentially in Moscow. As sources tell Bloomberg, Russia could escalate attacks on Ukraine after peace talks hit a wall. Former U.S. Ambassador to NATO Ivo Daalder joins us next on Balance of Power, only on Bloomberg TV and radio.
To not attacking a NATO territory?
I've had good talks with him. He's not going to be attacking a NATO territory.
To deliver a warning to Russia not to attack NATO territory during his...
Well, I don't want to comment on that, but they're not going to attack.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. President Trump there saying he does not think Russia will expand its aggression into NATO territory. The president insisted Vladimir Putin will not target NATO allies after having what he called, quote, good talks with the Russian president. It comes as sources close to the Kremlin tell Bloomberg News that Moscow could ramp up its attacks on Ukraine. That led in part to a rare secret trip to Moscow by CIA Director John Ratcliffe to deliver a direct warning. For analysis, we're joined now by the former U.S. ambassador to NATO, Ivo Daalder. Mr. Ambassador, thank you for joining us here on Bloomberg. And let's just get your take on this rare trip by the CIA director. We have the Wall Street Journal reporting this was to warn against attacks against NATO allies, whereas the New York Times is reporting that the message was more urging the Kremlin to come to the negotiating table. From what you've heard so far and the point we are at in this conflict, what do you think was discussed behind closed doors?
I think the likelihood is that both of those issues were discussed. On the one hand, clearly a sense that the intelligence community is worried about the Russians perhaps misreading the strength of NATO, the strength of the U.S. commitment to the defense of Europe, perhaps misreading that the lack of interceptors and munitions, much of which was used in the Gulf in the war against Iran, might give them an opening to challenge NATO and to challenge the U.S. commitment to NATO, but also a sense that an escalation against Ukraine, not just of more ballistic missiles against a country that no longer has really any interceptors to defend itself, but also possibly using other weapons, including nuclear weapons, that too is something we were worried about. And three, I would think that perhaps, and this is the New York Times report, a sense that the CIA director told the Russians, you know, you need to start telling Mr. Putin what's really happening. You're losing, 30 to 40,000 men each day on the battlefield. Ratcliffe has said himself publicly that the average life expectancy of a new recruit at the front line is 20 to 30 minutes. That's not what is the kind of data that is generally shared with Vladimir Putin. And if he could share them with him, that would be a good thing.
Well, Ambassador, what you just said is interesting. He urged his equivalent, the head of the FSB agency, to tell Putin. When William Burns traveled to Russia in 2021 to urge Russia to avoid the invasion of Ukraine, he met directly with Vladimir Putin, as we understand. What does that tell us about the dynamic with this administration and whether this will even get through to Putin?
Well, I think it tells us two things. One is, of course, that Vladimir Putin can pick up the phone and talk to Donald Trump anytime he wants, and Donald Trump will call back, or Donald Trump will reach out to him. Trump has made very clear that he looks at Putin as not just an equal, but somebody who he can trust. Remember that when he was asked about reports that the Russians were using intelligence given to the Iranians to attack Americans in the Middle East, he said, well, I don't know about that. I'll have to ask Putin about that. And so there is at least a one-way trust between the president of the United States and the president of Russia, perhaps not a two-way trust. So that's one part of it. The second is that, of course, Bill Burns was an ambassador to Russia. He knew Vladimir Putin extremely well. And the fact is that when he went, it was clear that this was a message from the president of the United States, and a very serious message. And Bill Burns has talked about this now publicly. He said, he laid out, we know everything you're doing. And Vladimir Putin says, yep, you're right. We're going to do that. And Burns said, you shouldn't. And of course he did.
At this point, what is the calculus between diplomacy, like a meeting such as this one, where the CIA director goes to Moscow, or the U.S. taking some firmer economic action, pressuring Russia to the negotiating table? What could be those options on the table? Because new this morning, we had a story on the Bloomberg terminal about how Russia earlier this year had to curb its spending due to the enormous cost that this war has cost the country, but that hasn't been enough to get them to start negotiating again.
Yeah, I think part of the problem is that we don't have a really concerted strategy to put pressure on Russia. We talk a little bit. We had the meeting in Anchorage. We have the phone calls between the president and Vladimir Putin, and the president seems to believe that if he just talks to somebody, they will do what he wants them to do. It turns out it isn't that simple. What you really need is a concerted strategy. So one is the military side, the continuation of helping Ukraine to defend itself, both through intelligence and weapon sales and weapons shipments. Unfortunately, we have run out of the most important defensive weapons now, the Patriot interceptors, because in part of the war that we launched against Iran. The second leg of the stool is really economic pressure and real economic pressure. And here, too, unfortunately, I think the president hasn't done as much as he could have done. We have the ability to impose sanctions under a new law that is now still being debated by Congress. He is himself saying that anybody who's helping the Iranians could face secondary sanctions. We haven't seen that happen on China. We certainly haven't seen it happen on Russia. So those kinds of pressures could be increased. And then finally, there is room for diplomacy. There's room for direct negotiations. There's room for talking. But the best way to do that is to send people who actually know what they're talking about, who actually know what the situation is, and to send people with a diplomatic background. Now, the CIA director can have a role because he has particular information that is important to share. But what we really need is real diplomats. Of course, the president doesn't believe in real diplomats. He sends his son-in-law and his best golfing buddy, who are nice people, I'm sure, but haven't demonstrated to be the best negotiators when it comes to ending these wars.
Interesting. Ambassador, the president spoke confidently today and said repeatedly when he was asked by reporters that Putin would never attack a NATO country. It's as if they had spoken today. If it did happen, are we confident that the U.S. would be there in an Article 5 incursion?
Well, I think this is part of the problem that we're facing. I can tell you that when I was the ambassador at NATO, and I think that almost every single one of my predecessors and successors would have answered that question, of course. Of course the United States would come to the aid of Europe for a very simple reason. No, I don't know, because the president has basically done something that is unique since the United States saw that its fate was tied with Europe. He no longer believes that the security of Europe is fundamental to the security of the United States. That is a very, very big difference. He frankly also doesn't believe that Russia is a threat. He said so, that Russia won't attack, and it isn't just because he's president and Vladimir Putin thinks he's a nice guy. He just doesn't think that Russia is a threat. He thinks that the war between Russia and Ukraine is like two little children fighting it out on a playground. It's not. It's a war of aggression. By Vladimir Putin against a sovereign, independent country. And so it is hard to see if you so miscalculate what Russia represents, so misunderstand what Vladimir Putin is all about, that you're going to look at the possibility of a confrontation between the United States and Russia, which is what a war between NATO and Russia would mean. So the worry that one has in Europe, the worry that I share, is Vladimir Putin may be misreading or accurately reading Donald Trump and decide to test it. And if Director Ratcliffe went to Moscow to say don't, that is a good thing. Whether he will be believed is quite another thing.
Quite a stark assessment. And just in the final minute that we have you, if we pick up on this idea of alliances, could Chinese President Xi Jinping's visit here to Washington in now less than a month produce any sort of progress when it comes to this conflict, considering that China still remains the top importer of Russian crude?
Yeah, no, I don't think there's going to be a solution to this. The Russians, the Chinese have made very clear they're very happy for this war to continue to sap Western attention and capabilities and divert it to Europe. Now the United States, with its war against Iran, has diverted much of the attention away from the Indo-Pacific, and I think that's exactly what Xi Jinping is looking for. More freedom for maneuver, and let them do what they want to do in that part of the world.
It's good to have you back, Ambassador. Almost looks like you're with us from Lake America. I think that's Lake Michigan. Ivo Daalder, great to have you with us on Bloomberg. Coming up, we turn to Jackson Hole. The speech is tomorrow. This is Bloomberg. It's Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio alongside Tyler Kendall. I'm Joe Matthew. President Trump moving to bring some relief to the grocery store temporarily, as we've told you, easing tariffs on beef to bring more foreign imports into the country. Right at the center of these developments, the state of Texas, where cattle producers in many cases are pushing back, warning the influx of cheaper imports could hurt American ranchers, just as, of course, President Trump arrives in Texas today for the RNC fundraiser that we were just talking about earlier. Joining us now to get to the source here and learn something real about this is the Texas Agriculture Commissioner, Sid Miller. Commissioner, it's great to see you, sir. Welcome to Bloomberg TV and radio. We've got a lot of questions for you, and I just want to start with the basic premise here. Will this move the president is making depress prices and take money out of the pockets of Texas cattle ranchers?
Well, it's a bad move for a couple of reasons, Joe. Number one, it doesn't do anything to build the cattle herd. It absolutely does not.
Yeah.
And second, even more important, it adds to our agriculture trade deficit. The previous administration left us a $50 billion ag trade deficit. First time in my lifetime that's ever happened. Normally, we sell, export a lot of agriculture products, but we're buying more food from foreign nations than we're selling. So that's a dangerous position to be in when you have foreign countries depending on, them to feed you. So we've got to do something to build the herd. So I suggest two things. One is a heifer retention tax credit. When your child, if you have one 17 or younger, you get $1,000 off your income taxes. Well, let's do something like that for the cattlemen. Let's give them $500 to keep a heifer and turn it into a mama cow. The other thing that it actually compounded the problem when we closed the border to Mexican cattle. It's much better if we walk cattle across on the hoof than buying it, beef in the box, because when you walk cattle in, they graze our winter pasture, our ranches, eat our grain, our corn, ride in our trucks and go through our processing plants. There's 2 million head in Mexico waiting to come in. That would rebuild the herd by 2 million. Hey, Tyson last week closed 3 packing plants. 2 million head would have kept them open.
That's right. Yeah.
So based off of what you're outlining, are you saying that this is more a federal issue, a way that the federal government could put forward solutions, or are there other things that the state should be taking into consideration when it comes to supporting America's cattle ranchers?
Well, the beef industry is scattered over the whole nation, so we need a nation solution. So that's why I suggested the heifer retention tax credits, opening the border to Mexico. Now, they've opened it, but we've only got in 750 head. At this rate, we might get 100,000 head by the end of the year. That's not going to do it. And really, I don't think beef is all that high compared to everything else. I just went to the grocery store. I don't know if you can see this or not, but there's ground beef, 80-20, $4.99 a pound. Chuck roast, $7.99 a pound. That seems fairly reasonable, especially when I am paying as a cattleman the highest prices for my 3 top inputs: high feed because of the drought, high diesel prices because of the Strait of Hormuz, and the highest fertilizer prices I've ever paid, also because of the Strait of Hormuz. So we're not on easy times, and bringing in foreign beef is complicating the problem.
Well, we know that they're really tough times, and that we know that farmers want to work, they want to produce, and they want to feed Americans. Commissioner Miller, there's also reality. Is there going to have to be another farmer bailout next year?
Well, possibly, but this is not helping because it's taking profits right out of the rancher's pocket, and the Trump administration has advisors. That's why he has a cabinet. A lot of ranchers are really disappointed in Secretary Rawlins for not weighing in on this. She fully supports this.
She won't say where the beef is coming from. Should we know what country the beef is coming from?
Well, let me tell you, I'm glad you brought that up. It's coming from any one of 20 countries. They won't tell us which one. But here's the problem, Joe. When it gets here, if you want to go to the grocery store and make sure you're buying U.S. beef and not beef from Brazil, you can't tell, because once it gets here, it can all be labeled product of USA. You can't tell the Australian beef from the Brazilian beef from the Argentine beef.
Wow, yeah.
It's all packaged. Now, USDA has a voluntary program, but we need a mandatory country of origin label. That's lying to the American consumer. That's deceptive advertising. That just really, chaps me off that we would do that to the American consumer, just flat out lie to them.
Have you spoken to Secretary Rawlins directly? Have you asked for any answers on these questions that you have?
I have, as recently as yesterday. We had a rather heated discussion, as a matter of fact, and she's going to stand behind the president's decision. But we would really like for her to stand up for the ranchers and farmers. and at least push our side of it so the president knows where we stand, because I'm the strongest supporter in Texas Trump has. He calls me Trump's man in Texas. I very rarely disagree with him. Matter of fact, only 2 times have I disagreed with him, and it was over Argentine beef and all these 300,000 metric tons of beef coming in from 20 different countries.
Only 2 times. I'm glad that you mentioned that, Commissioner, because we should tell our viewers and listeners that you're a MAGA supporter. You're a Trump guy, and you've tried to work with the administration all the way. Is the president risking losing the American farmer?
Well, I think he's, I'm real close to him. I'm right in the heartbeat of ranching country. Texas, we have more cattle than any other state, and they're really upset about this. We may lose some midterm elections over this. You can throw in data centers and solar farms and school choice and high property taxes, and we outlawed THC in Texas. There's a number of issues. We're having supporters drop off from this administration, unfortunately.
Are you worried that farmers are going to start selling their land for data centers to move in?
Well, they're already doing that. We've got 500 data centers. We have more data centers in Texas than China does. China stopped at 453. They said it was too big a strain on their infrastructure. We've got over 500 in just Texas. So the AI race is over. We've won it. We're going to have 5,000 in the United States. No one else even comes close. So the AI race is over. We need to get some parameters around this industry and try to get it, some guardrails around it, because it's just wild, wild west, especially in Texas.
Yeah.
Are those conversations about potential guardrails happening? Are you talking to the governor or other officials at the state level about what that would actually look like and what's feasible to get through?
Well, I've been talking about this for a year, but I'm the only statewide Republican that's doing so. Democrats are right on the issue. They're hammering it. The governor's starting to come around. He was he's the one that recruited them here and bragged on we're going to have the more AI data centers than any state. Well, he accomplished that. But we don't have any regulation in Texas, and our counties can't regulate them. They don't have any authority to do so. So they just come in here, use our water, our electricity, take up our most valuable farmland. They like it better than anything else. It's flat. It's ready to go. It's got water and electricity on it. They can just start building, and they don't need any building codes or anything.
Mm-hmm. I just want our listeners on the radio to know the commissioner is sitting in his vehicle wearing a white cowboy hat, and he held up the flyer from the grocery store to talk about prices. And before you leave us, Commissioner, because this is an awfully authentic conversation, you a ribeye man or a strip guy?
Here's ribeye is probably right in the middle, most flavorful. Tenderloin is the most tender, and the strip is the most flavorful. But it's not the tenderest. Okay. So I'm kind of a ribeye man. I like all three of the combinations.
I had a feeling he was going to say that, Tyler.
All right. Well, Texas Commissioner of Agriculture Sid Miller. Mr. Commissioner, thank you so much for joining us here on Bloomberg. We hope you'll come back soon. And turning now to the Federal Reserve, the central bank's biggest annual event is underway in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, as investors wait to hear how Fed Chair Kevin Warsh frames the outlook for policy, with inflation still well above target, and several policymakers warning that rates may not be high enough to cool the economy. Bloomberg's Michael McKee joins us now from Jackson Hole for a preview. So, Mike, I know that you spoke with one of those policymakers earlier today. How are you hearing Kevin Warsh's speech be framed? What are people expecting or perhaps not expecting when he takes the podium?
Well, a lot of the Fed officials here are trying to stay out of the conversation about what Kevin Warsh is going to say because they don't know, and they don't want to criticize the new chairman. But they do make it clear that they are either in the camp of let's hold rates where they are or rates need to go up. And you're referring to Jeffrey Schmidt, who's the Kansas City Fed Bank president and the host of this conference. When we spoke, he made it clear he's solidly on the Hawks side.
Sid Miller just gave us a taste of what American farmers are dealing with right now, Michael McKee. with beef prices moving high enough that the president is actually taking some action here, and it's against the backdrop of these new tariffs with Canada. To what extent are all of these storylines complicating Kevin Warsh's view?
Well, it's all difficult because it just shows, if you start talking about all of it, how chaotic this administration is. And one minute the president is focused on the Fed and lower interest rates, and another minute he's dealing with beef and AI data centers and things like that. So it's hard to stay out of the news no matter what business you're in. And at this point, the question is, Kevin Warsh, who the president has praised and says will do the right thing, but also said he's picking him to lower interest rates, can't lower interest rates. So how does he navigate this? And one of the ways he's been doing it is not to say much of anything. And that's got Wall Street upset because they want a little more guidance, further guidance, not necessarily forward guidance, on what he thinks about inflation and how he's going to get it back to 2%, which he's promised to do.
All right, Michael McKee, thank you so much. We'll, of course, have full coverage of the speech tomorrow, 10 a.m. Eastern time. Coming up, President Trump adding insult to injury with Canada, moving to rename Lake Ontario as tensions show no signs of cooling between the two nations. We've established that. Much more ahead on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
We're going to be changing the name of Lake Ontario, effective immediately, to Lake America. We lose on average over the last 15 years $60 billion a year carrying Canada, so we just can't do it anymore. We have a Gulf and we have a lake. Now all we need is an ocean. So maybe we'll have to change the name of the Atlantic and or the Pacific. Maybe we'll change them both.
The ocean of America? This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Tyler Kendall. Heard the president there fanning the flames with Canada earlier today, moving to rename, yes, the Great Lake of Ontario to Lake America. He even had the Sharpie to show for it as tensions between the two neighbors remain at historically high levels. Joining us now, at least we'll start here with our great political panel. Former RNC Communications Director Doug High in his triumphant return to the table, and former Special Assistant to President Biden, Megan Hayes. It's really great to have both of you. And thank you for coming here. You've spent some time in Texas. The president's on his way there right now with a race that is literally too close to call. And if you believe the polls, James Tallarico, or Talafrico, as President Trump calls him, could actually win, and his money advantage is overwhelming. Can President Trump start closing that gap tonight?
He needs President Trump to help close that gap. It is so significant. It was one of the warnings that folks who supported John Cornyn gave to the president and more broadly was that Paxton was not going to be able to raise the money. Yeah. We know all of the issues that he has. He has more baggage than the Love Boat. But the problem is it also makes it harder for him to reach out and raise the money that he needs to. Yeah. So he needs help from John Thune. He needs help from the Senatorial Committee and obviously from the president as well.
So then, Megan, do Democrats go all in on this race, divert resources to this race over some other competitive ones we're watching in Ohio or Michigan, if the polling is telling us that it really is this close?
Well, we're lucky that James Tallarico has raised a lot of money on his own, so I don't think that Democrats that from the national committees are going to have to divert that many resources into Texas. But I will say that he is an incredible candidate who's been ahead in the last 6 polls. Also, Gina Hinojosa has also been ahead of Greg Abbott. They're statistically tied right now, which is unfathomable to people who have worked in Texas and been around. The data center issue is a real issue for people, and I think that people are starting to vote on policies, and they are really tired of the economy, and so they're looking at other things. And Texas is a perfect example where they have 2 weak candidates, and Democrats have stronger candidates.
Well, you know Texas really well.
Kendall's question real quick.
Yeah.
Every Republican campaign outside of Texas was praying for John Cornyn to win.
That's right.
So that money could go into North Carolina, Maine, Ohio. So much Republican money is going to be pumped into Texas that could cost one of those seats that Republicans
You said
need to
Paxton has more baggage than the Love Boat, which is a line worth repeating. But the Republicans would say the same about James Tallarico, that we've got so much tape on him talking about transgender and all the rest that he simply is unelectable in Texas. You're clearly seeing it otherwise.
I mean, I think people are tired of their pocketbooks being low. They can't afford their groceries. They can't afford gas. Greg Abbott has energy prices have been incredibly high. And I think that people see Ken Paxton as an incumbent because he is supported supported by Donald Trump, and he's been in elected office statewide for a very long time. And I think people are willing to take a chance on somebody else, but I think we're seeing that writ large on the campaign trail a lot this cycle. We're in an anti-incumbency cycle, so I'm not surprised that James Tallarico and Gina are ahead of Greg and Ken.
Okay. So to pick up on policy, and Megan mentioned data centers, that's factoring very largely into all of the races that we're seeing in Texas. Actually, a rare area of disagreement between the governor and President Trump, who actually rebuked his bid to put some more guardrails around data center development. How do candidates on both sides of the aisle, frankly, walk this line between trying to bolster the U.S.'s competitiveness around this, but also some really real voter concerns?
Well, I just learned a few minutes ago here on Bloomberg that the AI race is over. But that said, look, Republicans and Democrats are still trying to figure out how to talk about this issue. Sometimes Democrats and Republicans were aligned, and now we're seeing divisions within parties and between parties. Josh Shapiro in Pennsylvania is a good example. Add to that the new issue of flock cameras. Like we're already saying that flock cameras are the new AI.
The new data center.
AI and how that has been an issue that has really come from the bottom up, from city council meetings, county council meetings, and so forth. We're seeing both of these come out of nowhere.
I want to go back to Sid. If you were with us on Bloomberg TV or on YouTube, he was sitting in his car. He had his white cowboy hat on. And he's not happy, guys. This is MAGA. This is the man who the president called his Texas guy. And you know what he said? I'm just looking at the transcripts. They're upset about this, talking about cattlemen in his state. We may lose midterm elections over this. We are having supporters drop off from the administration, unfortunately. Is there time to turn that around?
We're running out of time. And I think the challenge for the Trump administration and Republican candidates is the depression within the base. I was in Lake of the Ozarks, Missouri 2 weeks ago. I go there every summer. And I counted 2 Trump flags and 1 MAGA hat.
How many should there be?
Compared to previous years, boats would be festooned with Trump paraphernalia, whether it's hats or flags, and waving a flag is a much bigger deal than a yard sign. The base is depressed because they're paying the same prices for beef and everything else that everyone else is. And that's a real risk for Republicans in any race that they're looking at now.
But at the end of the day, President Trump's not on the ballot. But there are things that Congress could do before the midterm elections. Joe had asked about the idea of aid for farmers, which right now is stalled because it's tied to the conflict in Iran. We don't have to get into all of that wonkiness here. But could Congress do something beyond the president's scope that could maybe help build up this coalition?
It's more likely there'll be talk about what they could or should do and then blame assigned wherever it may go. Just because Congress has very little time come next week, very little time back in D.C. before they all hit the campaign trail again.
We've talked about Texas here a lot and some of the sort of issues that are driving things. Do you believe, as many do, that all politics are national and these same issues that we're talking about, data center, flock cameras, will drive the other Senate races that matter, whether it's Michigan, Maine, or otherwise?
Yeah, I just think on those 2 issues in particular, people are putting their anxiety and their energy into the unknown, into data centers, into flock cameras, because it's a lot driven around AI. People don't know what AI is going to do, if it's going to take their job, how much it's going to cost us, what our economy is going to look like after data centers or flock cameras are using AI. And so I think that a lot of anxiety is driven to those 2 issues. And I think that with data centers, Democrats have to be very careful here, because we do need data centers, and we have to figure out how to have them in our communities, whether they're regulated and whether we're talking about them appropriately, and we have to address the concerns with AI. And they're 2 separate issues that are being conflated into one a lot of the times. And I think that those issues are going to be, those are in every community. So that is a national issue that is going to impact every community.
There's talk of rushing a vote on this before November. House leaders might, in fact, get together in legislation to rein in data center costs. And, Doug, everybody can fan out and say, we addressed this for you. We heard you. Will that help?
Listen, I worked on so many Obamacare repeal and replace votes, and so many of them were about our members going home and saying, this is what we did. So having a vote on that makes a lot of sense. Thinking that might become law between now and the election, no chance.
Not a chance.
I wanted to also ask about other policies related to this. As we're talking about farmers, we're talking about tariffs. And I posed this question at the beginning of the show to Jessica Taylor, who joined us. Doug, is there a way to thread the needle for Republicans between the protectionist policies of tariffs that steel workers like, with also the blowback that comes from tariffs and the electorate at large that's unhappy with higher prices.
Yeah, if it's possible right now, that is the eye of the needle that nobody's figured out how to thread. And it's because of where prices are right now. And add to that the protectionist policies that Trump seems to make up overnight or in the middle of the day that come out of nowhere, Canada being a great example. And these policies come with impacts not just on American consumers, but on American businesses. So if you go to Canada, you don't see a lot of American products being sold right now. That has an impact here as well.
And we're seeing the trade war escalate at this point. Ambassador Greer today, Megan, said that maybe we could even see a ban on some Canadian exports to this country. What do Democrats have to do at this point when it comes to the economy? Is it presenting new ideas, or is it just at this point criticizing President Trump?
Well, they can't do anything right now. They have no control over any branch of the government, so there's nothing that they can do. All they can do is win back the majority in the House and make the majority slimmer if they... I don't firmly believe that Dems will win the Senate, but if they make it smaller, that's always good for them. But until then, there's not a whole lot they can do. I think the tariff issue is it create a lot of chaos, whether they're good or bad. They just create chaos because they're so uncertain and nobody knows what's coming. And they're not these long negotiated things that everyone can plan for. So that's what's creating the chaos. But Democrats have to, unfortunately, they have to win these elections or they won't be able to do anything.
Yeah, a lot of fertilizer and potash comes from Canada into Iowa. Also a big Senate race, big gubernatorial race.
All the potash does, I think, right? I mean, or you can go to Russia to buy it if you want. So last day on the job for Karoline Leavitt. That means something to you, having worked in a different press and comm shop in a different White House. I think that we can all agree that this is, I guess, great for her, that she will not have to carry the torch on Lake America, which the president is making clear today. He actually took the Sharpie, crossed out Ontario, and wrote Lake America. You can weigh in on that if you want. But who is going to win this season of The Apprentice and be the next press secretary?
Oh, I have no idea, but I'll tell you it ultimately doesn't matter. Yeah. The reality is the president of the United States is who matters. That's always true. It's probably even more true with this one. And we've had good press secretaries and bad press secretaries, but it always is about that president.
Or maybe we just have an acting press secretary. What's going to happen?
I mean, he's a lame duck come November, so I don't actually think what matters coming out of his office anyways. They're going to start running for president. He's going to become less important. I am, as someone who's worked in the White House, I think that they're extremely hard jobs, so I am glad that she is stepping aside and taking time to be with her family. I think that's an honorable thing to do. She served honorably, and I think that's important to remember here too.
Sure. You spent enough time in that room to know.
Right. I mean, we heard Karoline Leavitt today say that at the end of the day, she likes to joke that President Trump is the true press secretary.
Well, that's 100%. Exactly what you're saying, Doug.
Yeah.
Does she run for Congress? We're almost out of time, but she's got a political future, right?
If she's smart, she doesn't run for Congress. That would be the worst place for her to be.
Really?
Go spend time with your family and then make some money.
Okay, make some money and then what? Run for Senate?
I would not run for office.
Don't run for office. She already made one run. I thought maybe there'd be something there for her. Doug Heye, Megan Hayes, thank you so much for both being here. This is a great panel, and we would love to have you both back. Check out the Washington Edition newsletter to follow up on all the stories that we've been talking about on the terminal and online. And thanks for joining us on Balance of Power. Alongside Tyler Kendall, I'm Joe Matthew. We'll see you back here tomorrow, only on Bloomberg TV and radio.